Okay, we're up, and you can go ahead and put that. Is that PowerPoint on? Yes. Okay, it's not at the beginning. I want it at the beginning. There we go. Okay. All right. Good to see everybody tonight. And if I can't see you and you're online, welcome. We're in Luke chapter 22. I was sort of feeling pretty good about our progress because I left here last week thinking that we had gotten halfway through chapter 22 and we're on track for the, half chapter a week to be done by the end of March. And so I got ready to start getting ready for tonight and realized that we only got through about a quarter, not even a quarter of chapter 22. And there's a lot still left in there. So, that being the case, I'm going to try to get through chapter 22. I'm not going to sweat it too much because chapter 24 is kind of short. And if we have to compress some stuff, that'll be a place maybe where we can make up some time. I had given you some homework last week because we had gotten to the point where Jesus was getting ready to celebrate the Passover, and talked a little bit about how there seems to be a little bit of confusion about when Jesus was celebrating the Passover and when the Pharisees were going to celebrate the Passover, and whether or not, one of them did it early, or, whether Jesus did it early because, he had places to be and had to be arrested and whatever. Rather than have a long discussion about that, let me just share with you a couple of thoughts about how you reconcile some of that. They're basically three related but sort of different arguments about the fact that Jesus was actually celebrating the Passover, and he was celebrating it at the right time, and that the Pharisees, when they celebrated the Passover, were doing it at their appointed time. And it centers around three things. One is the way that Jewish time worked different than the way that we did, and that the day changed not at midnight but earlier, so that you had part of what we had as a day would be the next day and whatever. Second of all, and maybe more significant because it's going to come into play later on in Luke, is the hour and the time and the day also depended on whether or not you were counting time under the way that the Jews counted time, or whether you were looking at the way that the Romans counted time, because that was different, and there was even a further shift. And for example, some of the supposed contradictions between the time of Jesus' crucifixion and his death are easily reconciled when you realize that in one reference, they're talking from a Jewish time perspective, and in the other, they're talking from Roman. The last one, and the more interesting one to me, is found in this book I recommended a few weeks ago, Prelude to Glory, where he talks about how that under the law of Moses, the Passover was to be celebrated on the 14th of, and I forget the month name. I don't know all the. Yeah, I think so. I mostly know the Jewish months from crossword puzzles, okay? I've never memorized the order of them. But by Jesus' day, for whatever reason, tradition or just they wanted to do it that way, it was being celebrated on the 15th. And so if in fact Jesus celebrated it a day earlier than the way that the Pharisees and the rest of the Jews celebrated the Passover, he was actually doing it on the day that was appointed under the law of Moses, and those guys were doing what tradition was. Be that as it may. It's the Passover time, and we read last week about the preparations that were being made. We read about Judas betraying Jesus, and how that was really necessary because of the crowds and the people. They needed a time and a place where they could get Jesus alone. And they had been unsuccessful in previous attempts to try to grab him and to deal with him. And just to underscore what a madhouse and how crowded it was in Jerusalem at this time, in AD 63, under Nero's rule, the Jews were becoming more and more of a problem to Rome, but Nero didn't see it. And the governor in Judea at that time needed to convince Nero that you got a real problem here with the stubbornness and the rebellion of the Jews. And so he did a physical count of all of the lambs that were slaughtered for Passover in Jerusalem that year. And it was over 250,000 lambs. Okay? And in Josephus' writing, he gives like a specific number. It's like 263,167 or something like that. I mean, there was a count that was done, which is a big number, but it kind of blows your mind when you realize that in order to qualify as a lamb to be slaughtered in the temple ground for Passover, you had to have a minimum of 10 people ready to eat that lamb. And there were so many hours you had to eat it after it was slaughtered in the courtyard. So you're talking about, now this is 20 or 30 years after Jesus, but you're talking somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people eating the Passover in Jerusalem. And in Jesus' day, the population of Jerusalem was about 50,000. So again, this need that the Pharisees had not only to get around the crowd, but just to physically find Jesus so that they could go and arrest him was a big need. And so when Judas marches in and said, yeah, what do you give me? And they were delighted because now we've got a way for that to happen. And so that's going on. The Passover's being prepared, and we get to verse 14. Let's read a few verses. It says, when the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I'll not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who's going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him. And they began to question themselves which of them might do this. I remember a few years ago reading through Luke and reading through this, and all of a sudden I got confused. It's like Jesus did the cup before he did the bread. Maybe we didn't do it wrong all this time. But in fact, what's happening is Jesus here is incorporating this and really recommissioning or re-symbolizing what is happening with some of the emblems from the Passover, from the delivery from Egypt and looking forward to the coming of the kingdom, to his own death and the kingdom being ushered in. And so the first cup that he takes is just one of, depending on who you talk to, either 3 or 4 cups that are part of the Passover meal. And most of what I read seemed to think that this first cup that he took, that Luke mentions, is the second cup, which was called the cup of blessing. And then after that, again, as a part of what was kind of the regular sequence of the Passover meal, he took the bread, which was known as the bread of affliction, and certainly symbolizing in the past the affliction the Israelites had suffered in Egypt, and now applying that affliction to his body that's going to be broken and going to be sacrificed. And then the last cup that he uses and incorporates into communion was probably the last cup, which was a cup of thanksgiving. Okay, and so he does this. Yes, Chris.
I've heard some discussion about the Passover Seder meal that the cup that he used was the cup of Elijah,
Okay.
which they would set aside because there was a prophecy that Elijah would come, and so they, in their tradition, would have a cup that was specifically Elijah's cup. And some scholars I've read said that he took the cup of Elijah and made it his cup.
Okay.
This is a cup of my blood. So there's some discussion about that.
Well, as I talked about last week, there are some folks who because of the what they think is a time difference, think he wasn't even doing the Passover at all. But I think it's pretty clear from Scripture that he is. Again, this book, if you want to read about the Passover, if you want lots of detail about how it was conducted, this is a great resource. It goes into all kinds of things about the sequence and the bitter herbs and what they represented and the sequence and the order. And in fact, it goes into talking about where these guys were sitting, which is kind of interesting. Yes, Chris?
Well, I think the most important thing that he said about that cup is this is the new covenant in my blood. And we've done some study and conversation about this covenant, that God cut a covenant with Abraham where he had Abraham cut the animal, lay the pieces there with a gap in the middle. Typically it was the person that was making the covenant with the higher authority would walk the pieces so that he made this covenant. And it meant I will die like this animal if I break this covenant. It was a covenant of blood. But in this case, God made the covenant with Abraham, and he walked the pieces. Okay. And he said, if you sin, I will pay the price, symbolically with Abraham. And when Jesus said, this is a new covenant in my blood, he's making a new contract with people, and it's God that's making the contract, and God is paying the price for this contract. Nobody makes God make a contract. But the fact that he made the covenant with us at his expense for him to be the leader of that covenant is, I think, the more significant thing here, rather than whether they took the first cup or the second cup or the third, before the bread or after the bread. People fight about that stuff. But the fact that God made a covenant with us at his expense is incredible.
Yes. And if you guys want to go another 8 or 9 months, we can go into that. I would suggest we're on our Monday night Zoom class. We've been going through the book of Hebrews, and in particular, chapter 9 goes into this whole idea of the new covenant. And interestingly, the covenant that Hebrews talks about is not the covenant with Abraham, but it's the covenant with Moses and the law of Moses, and about how Moses sprinkled blood on the people when this covenant was put into place. And so for the folks here at the Passover and for other places, when they thought about the covenant, they thought first, I believe, about the covenant with Moses. Certainly the covenant with Abraham that set up, the promises and whatever, but the covenant that came in with the law and all of the sacrifices and that led to the Passover came with the law and with the law of Moses. Lots and lots of symbolism that's there. And Jesus it's just one more place where Jesus ties in the fact that what's going on is part of a plan that's been in place for ages, since the beginning. And just as the Passover looked back to the delivery from Egypt and forward to the Messiah and the delivery in the new kingdom, Jesus takes and says, that's what's happening. That's what's happening now. But let's talk a little bit about the table. Let's skip through some of this stuff here. That supposedly is a place where they think that this supper might have taken place. Nobody knows. Okay. This is a diagram from this book. We're used to seeing, the Last Supper painting, and Jesus is always in the middle. But traditionally in Jesus' day, the host would sit where, how about that? It disappears. I can't do that. Okay, well, you see Jesus up there, right? That's where the host would typically sit. And to his right, in the far left, is where the youngest person would sit who was at the dinner. Okay? And as far as I can tell, it's this seating and other general references to John being young that leads folks to say, well, this means that John was the youngest disciple. Okay? Couldn't find a scripture that said that. Okay? But because of this seating, he's sitting in the place that traditionally the youngest person would sit. And the way it was set up is to Jesus' left and continuing around the table would be where the most important guests would sit in descending order. Okay, you remember Jesus warning the Pharisees about, you go in and you take the prominent seats, be careful, somebody's going to get up and ask you to move. Well, we're going to read just in the verses right after this about the disciples arguing amongst themselves who's the greatest. It may be connected with the seating chart and where folks were sitting. But isn't it remarkable that the place of honor next to the host was Judas? Okay? And we know that because Jesus says, the person that I'm, he's right here with me. I'm dipping in his dish. Okay? And because of the scriptures that talk about Peter leaning over to John and saying, who's he talking about? Ask him who he's talking about. When Jesus said that somebody was going to betray him, would indicate and imply that Peter is sitting in the seat of the least important guest. Now, why do you think he might be there?
Because what he was about to do. Maybe.
Okay, I'm not talking about Judas. I'm talking about Peter.
Peter.
Okay, all right. What was
Peter was
Peter
going
about
to
to
betray
do?
Jesus. So I mean, maybe it's like kind of foretelling the humbling that is coming.
Maybe. I'm going to suggest something else. Why? Maybe you can think about some other things that have gone on connected with this Passover from the other Gospels. Jeannie.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm on your wavelength, but
Okay.
Peter's got the keys to the kingdom that's going to
Okay.
be coming up. And maybe that was going to be a high position in between them. So he
Okay.
gave him a low position. I don't know.
Okay, all right. In just a little bit, we're going to read the passages where Jesus tells them, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you need to be the servant. You need to be the least, okay?
Does it have maybe something to do with Peter saying that he didn't want Jesus to wash his feet?
I think there's a connection there. Somewhere in here, and this author seems to think that the washing of the feet didn't happen at the beginning of the meal, but happened in the middle of the meal. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But remember, what did Peter say when Jesus came to wash his feet? You're not going to do that. I'm not going to let you do that. And of course, Jesus said, if I don't, then you have no part with me. He said, well, baptize me, dunk me, get me all wet. So,
I think the whole thing's wrong because Leonardo drew it in a nice.
okay. And he was there, right? Okay. Irene.
Would it be possible for Jesus to have said that night, let's not pay attention to seating arrangements tonight. Let's just sit where we want.
Well, in a sense, but I think it was different than that. I think it was more what we read about in verse 24. Also, a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. When you read through all of the Gospels, this is not a one-time event. This is a recurring discussion and argument among these guys. If you guys remember 8 months ago when we were in Luke chapter 9, and Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem to be crucified, they started arguing amongst themselves about who was the greatest and who was the most important. You read in the other Gospels, somehow connected to the triumphal entry into Jerusalem and that sequence of events, there's a recording of them arguing amongst themselves about who was the greatest. And James and John's mother come into Jesus and say, we want you to, set them up here. One needs to be on the right. It was an ongoing thing. So much so that even at this dinner, I think maybe they were squabbling about who was going to sit where. And depending on when the foot washing happened, perhaps it was Peter duly chastened. Said, man, I'm going to go down here to the bottom. I'm going to sit here at the bottom. Now, I'm speculating, okay, certainly. But the connection of this arguing amongst themselves, even in the Passover, as they're coming, Jesus is hours away from being arrested. The night is not going to end before he's drug off. They're arguing about that stuff. And it's in that context that Jesus gets up in John 13 and washes their feet. You guys are missing the point. You guys aren't getting it. Jeannie.
Wasn't that part of like what they grew up with? These men that would go to, church and at 12 or whatever it is, and learn from the Pharisees and all these people, and they were all into who was going to be the greatest and who looked the best.
Okay.
So maybe that was just
What
they learned.
It's human nature. Okay, think about maybe work situations that you've been in, where you've gone into meetings that have involved various strata of whatever organization that you're in. Just sort of sit and watch where people sit. I used to kind of make a sport of it. I'd go in and sit along the wall and just sort of watch, and that person, he's going to try to sit next to the head honcho, and that person's not. And sure enough, it's just human nature. We want to be recognized. We want to be important. And certainly in a situation where we're talking about the Messiah and the coming of the kingdom and triumph and all of these kinds of things, man, it's time. And, at the Passover, if there's a place for me to jockey around and find my place and sort of cement, show Jesus, but also show these other guys, where I fit in the pecking order, I think this whole dispute is just the continuation of what they were doing, and now it's spilled over into where are we going to sit at this dinner. I don't want to be that guy down at the bottom. Okay, but somehow Peter gets there. Okay, and he leans over to John when Jesus says, somebody's going to betray me. Who's he talking? Even though Jesus says it's the person I'm sharing the dish with, they still, what's he talking about? Okay, and who is it? Who could it be? And so the dispute rose, and Jesus said to them, verse 25, the kings of Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who's at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. What's Jesus saying here? See, it seems like maybe a little bit of a mixed message. It's not. But he starts out with this, you need to serve. You need to be servants, not lording it over other people. Yeah, Matt.
I think maybe he's redefining their idea of the seats of power.
Okay.
But also expressing his deep appreciation for them sticking with him through these tough times.
He's in a sense, he's commissioning them. We talk about the Great Commission in Matthew. But Luke here is making clear that, I'm leaving. And you guys, you have stuck with me. And for all your squabbling, for all the things that you guys have argued about, you guys have stuck with me. Okay? And understand don't worry about where you're going to have to sit or where you get to sit. It's coming, and I'm conferring on you this kingdom, and you're going to have some authority and you're going to have some power. But don't do it like the Gentiles did. That's a powerful message as Luke is writing to his Gentile reader, okay? That, again, to the very end, this was not, 12 really clever marketing guys who figured, Jesus is gone, we got to do something with this. I know, we'll set up this multi-level marketing plan and we'll take over things that way. This is guys that don't have a clue, but that were commissioned by Jesus not to take up arms to avenge his death, but to be servants. Okay, that's the message, I think, not only to them, and I think it's one of the messages for us to get from that. It's not about who all recognizes you, where you get to sit, what you're asked to do, who says nice things about you. It's about being servants. Okay. But he goes on in verse 31. Yes, I'm sorry, Michael.
Though he was Jesus trying to teach him through his ministry that though he was a king, but he came to serve, not to rule over the people, but to serve. And he continued to try to drill this through their heads, like I said, as it was jockeying for position around the table. And like he said in the text, that the greatest among you is the one who serves. We're all servants. There's only one king, but we must serve the king, even though he was a king, but he learned to serve to honor his father. And so this is the lesson he's continuing trying to teach his disciples. Don't be like the Gentiles. Don't be like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the scribes. They had to learn a lesson to humble themselves. And Peter had to learn a lesson of humility, to humble himself, because he was very quick to speak, quick to blurt out. So he had to learn humility and to learn how to persevere.
Okay, well, in fact, the conversation's not over, because in the very next breath, right after he says, okay, you guys be servants. Don't worry about where you're going to sit. You're getting the kingdom, and you're going to have authority. You're going to have authority from me. But he turns right around in verse 31. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny 3 times that you know me. You may have a footnote in your Bible that says when Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, that you is plural. That he's referring, Satan has asked, and I don't know what that means, and I don't know how that happened, but Satan has asked to tear you guys up. Let me at him. But Simon, when you've turned back, you need to strengthen these guys. Okay? Changes the personage of what Jesus is saying when he talks about, Satan's after all you guys, but Peter, I'm looking to you. These guys, you set yourself in the lowest seat. Maybe sat down in exasperation or, just to, stubbornly like a child show you that, well, I'll show you, I'll sit in the least seat. I don't know that was going on. But Simon, you got a role to play, and some bad things are going to happen to you tonight. You're going to wind up denying me not just once, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. Chris.
I think it's interesting that he said that right in front of everybody.
Yeah.
He didn't just say it to Peter in the corner. Apparently, it was part of the table discussion.
Okay.
And, it was a heavy blow what he told Peter, and it came true exactly that way.
Okay.
But looking back on this, even for Peter to look back on this, has to be a faith strengthener, because there was no surprise to Jesus what was going to happen that night. And he told Peter, he told Judas that he was going to do what he did. I mean, there was no surprises, and they were totally blindsided by the whole thing. Jesus was not. He had it totally under control and knew exactly what was going to unfold. And when they look back after the fact that he had told them these things, it has to be a strengthener of their faith.
Okay. Just as Jesus said this in front of the other disciples. I think in Matthew 16, when Jesus says, Peter, you know, you're blessed, and I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom. He said that in front of them as well. And don't you know that wasn't part of the discussions when they started jockeying about who was important? I got the keys to the kingdom. Okay, guys, you know, you guys argue about the rest of this. So, you know, there was some recognition there, I think, on the part of the other disciples. But certainly Jesus is calling Peter. He's saying, you know, I'm telling you, look, this is going to happen. But when you return, and what encouraging words those are. When you turn back, okay, it's not going to be over. It's like you're not going to blow it, and that's it. And you got to go do what Judas is going to do, because he, you know, he couldn't live with it. When you come back, I want you to strengthen your brothers. There's another hand over here. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, leadership comes with a price, and that's what he's trying to explain to Peter. You know, as James said later on, you know, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. And like I said, Peter was gung-ho, always wanted to speak out. He wanted the role, but he didn't want to pay the persecution, the price he had to go through. So Jesus was teaching him, these are things you're going to go through for leadership. Learning how to serve, it comes with a price. Everything's not going to go your way. And so, like you say, when you strengthen your, when you go through this, you strengthen your brothers, go back and strengthen your brothers, and that's what leadership all about. Leadership, taking accountability, like Mike was teaching his class on Sunday. You know, that's how you come resolve. You got to take ownership of it. And he's telling Peter, you got to take ownership of this thing. It's just not going to say, you know, I'm the high honcho because I got, like you say, I got the keys to the kingdom. It's a great price, and that's why elders is a great price. It's a great thing you got to go to, and that's why the Bible tells us to pray for your elders, pray for each and every one, because it's a great responsibility, and God's going to hold you accountable for those things.
Okay. All right, Michael's referring to Mike's class on resolutions on Sunday. I've sat in on a couple of those. That's a good class. So if you recommend it, if you're looking for a Sunday morning class. Well, not only is Peter, you know, he's ready to speak, he pops off here. Deny you 3 times. They arrest you, they're arresting me. I'm going to jail, and they kill you, they're killing me. I tell you the truth, Peter. Before the rooster crows today, you'll deny 3 times that you know me. And when we get to that, maybe tonight, maybe we'll get there before the end of the night. Luke's description of what happens when he denies is the most poignant, heartbreaking description in all of the Gospels. And we'll talk about that. So he says, Jesus asked him, when I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered. I'm in verse 35. He said to them, but now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It's written as he was numbered with the transgressors, and I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. The disciple said, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. That's enough, he replied. What in the world is going on here? We've been talking all this time about how Jesus is not going to do this armed revolution and overthrow the Romans. He's talking to them about buying swords. What's going on? Why does he tell them to buy a sword?
I think, like Peter, sometimes, you know, you think you're more righteous than you really are in the eyes of God. So that's probably how Peter felt. He thought he was righteous and then he denied Christ.
Okay. Other thoughts about what Jesus is telling these guys? Yeah, Matt.
Well, it does strike me as a little weird when he says, take a number of things, and then, okay, they found 2 swords pretty quickly, and he's like, that's enough. So maybe the provision that he gave them when he sent them out earlier was that God was with them. And now they need to take things because there's going to be an absence of God for a moment, and
Okay.
maybe it was a short moment, and 2 swords represented just a little bit.
Okay, I think you're on to something. I think he is contrasting for them what it was like when he sent them out before and what it's going to be like when they go out after the crucifixion and after the resurrection. Okay, when they went out the first time, he told them not to take a purse or sandal, any of that kind of stuff. What else did he tell them not to do when he sent them out earlier?
I didn't get that part.
Okay, don't take a money bag. You're not doing this for money. Okay, that's not why I'm sending you out. He also said, don't fight with people. Don't argue with them. If they won't receive you, you shake the dust off your feet and you just leave them. And that was in a time and in a context when Jesus was pretty popular. He already had some enemies. Okay, but hearing about the possible Messiah and this guy that's doing miracles, and you're telling me about him, that's not necessarily a threatening message. Now you've got a message where you're going to have opposition, and you need to be prepared. You need to take care of yourself. You need to protect yourself. Okay, you need, and I think in that sense, having a sword is not an offense. It's not an offensive weapon. It's sort of like Paul using his Roman citizenship in Acts. He had those rights and he used them when it was appropriate. Okay? He's talking more about the ministry that you're going in. It's not going to be, everything roses. It's going to be tough, and you got to make preparation, and you've got to go prepared. And so he says, okay, let's go. And they say, well, here's a couple swords. I would love to know the tone of voice that Jesus said, that's enough. In my mind, it was sort of said with an inflection of, yes, you're not getting it. Okay, that's enough. Okay, we're not, I'm not going out here and you guys are going to jump up with a bunch of swords and overcome these guards and these folks who are coming to arrest me. That's not what it's about. Okay, we don't need any. That's enough. We don't need any more than that. Daryl.
But you pretty much said exactly what I was going to say. This second time they went out, the battle was going to be a spiritual battle, and it was going to be significantly harder than the first one they went through. So they needed to be prepared also in their minds and also physically as well, because people weren't gonna. This message was not going to be received very well.
Okay. Let's read on, verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, pray that you'll not fall into temptation. He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he arose from prayer, he went back to his disciples, and he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? He asked them. Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. This is probably the shortest of the 4 Gospels about what happened in Gethsemane. And I think to a Gentile audience, the main point is Jesus went out to the garden to pray, And what he was fixing to do, he was not floating through this thing like, well, you know, I'm really divinity, so this is not really hurting me. You know, I'm going to go through these motions, and it's going to look like I'm going through a lot, I'm going through pain, but I'm not really. Luke said, no, that wasn't it at all. He's in so much agony that his sweat was like drops of blood. Okay. Irene, did you have something?
Yeah, just going back a little bit. Going back a little bit, do you think there's any significance in the fact that earlier he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked, and he calls him Simon. Then afterwards he says, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any significance to him using his name.
When you got in trouble, did your mama ever call you by a different name? When she was getting on to you a little bit? Yeah, okay. Well, David Lee, now, you know, he never called me by my middle name.
So you think that's what it is?
I'm speculating, but I think it may be as simple as that.
Okay.
You know, if anything, it's a little more personal. You know, Simon, and then you know Peter. You know, I don't know if I have the okay. That you recognize that, Tim? Okay, what is that? Okay, olive tree on the Mount of Olives that probably somebody tried to tell you was alive when Jesus was there. Okay? I've heard from multiple sources that when you go to the Mount of Olives, there are 4 distinct places that all claim to be the spot on the Mount of Olives where Gethsemane was. Okay? Nobody knows that sells tickets. Okay? And they try to tell you that these olive trees were, you know, are old enough. And again, I don't know. I'm not a botanist. I'm not an arborist or whatever. But I did read in several sources that Jerusalem is so crowded, it's so dense down in the cities. They didn't have city parks, okay? They didn't have little squares where you could go and sit out and have your cup of coffee or whatever, you know, in the morning. And so on the Mount of Olives were a number of privately owned gardens, presumably by more wealthy folks, who wanted a place near the city where they could go out and get away from, you know, just all of the hustle and bustle. And at the time of the Passover, with tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of people, you know, crowded around. And in some manner, Jesus had come to have access to those. Perhaps, you know, one of the landowners had given him access or whatever. But as it says, and several of the Gospels say that, you know, it was his custom to go out there and pray, which Judas knows. Okay? And so at the end of this Passover dinner, they go. It's about from where they think the Last Supper took place, about a half an hour walk from there to Gethsemane. And goes, it's happening, it's time. Jesus is in real anguish, you know. Think about the times that in your life that you have dreaded something, okay? Don't know what it was, don't know how significant, you know, you may have had some experiences where you were in really mortal dread. Jesus, tempted every way as we were, went through that on a scale beyond what probably most of us have gone through. And Luke just makes the point here. Jesus is not floating through this. This is really happening to him. Any other thoughts before we move on? We're doing good. I don't know we'll get to the end, but we'll get most of it. Verse 47, while he was still speaking, a crowd came up. And the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you've come to me with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts. You didn't lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." If you read the other Gospels, it's interesting the positioning of what's happening here. Jesus is actually positioning himself at the entrance to the garden to protect his disciples. Okay? In fact, I think it's John. He goes out and says, "Who you guys looking for?" Okay? And they say, well, Jesus, and it's me. And that wonderful scene of them all falling to the ground that I just would imagine in my mind. But the position of them in the garden to get out from Jerusalem at night, they didn't have flashlights. There were no street lights, okay? There wasn't they were coming with torches. I'm sure Jesus watched them coming. Here they come. This is it, okay? And Judas comes up. Why would Judas choose to betray Jesus with a kiss? Chris.
Well, I had a different comment, but
Go ahead. Say what you were going to say.
I just wanted to remind us that when there were torches coming in the dark, they weren't hiding. There's no way he didn't know they were coming. And he did not run the other way. He didn't find himself some other place to be like anybody else would have. He stood right there and waited on them to come to him. And
They didn't find him in a hole in the ground like they found Saddam Hussein.
no, he wasn't
Hiding and
running, trying to
cowering.
find some place to hide.
Met him at the entry. Who are you guys looking for? Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Daryl.
If I'm not mistaken, the kiss was a prearranged signal to alert the guys that were picking him up that that was him.
Yeah, I think what I'm getting, it was a prearranged signal, and what I'm getting at in the interest of time is that was the customary way that a disciple greeted their rabbi. Okay, so it wasn't this sort of weird thing where all of a sudden, Jesus wanted to start kissing on Jesus. It's like, that's the way you greeted a rabbi. Okay, and that would be a way that the guy that I kiss, that's the guy that, is calling himself a rabbi that you guys want to get. That's how you'll know to get him. Because again, they've had a lot of false starts where they've tried to seize him and he's just walked away, slipped away. And so now they've got a way where you can get right up next to him. And they're there with the temple guard, and there's also Roman soldiers with them as well. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week when we talk about the trials and where he goes and who's there. But Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas, has gone to Pilate to secure the soldiers. Pilate, we need some help. We're going to get this guy, and he keeps slipping away from us. We don't want the people to riot, so you need to help us out. And then, of course, we have somebody jumping up and cutting off servant of the high priest's ear. Who was that? Who did the cutting? How you know?
Mark chapter 13.
Okay, all right. The other gospel tell us it was Peter. Jesus, I'm going to die. To die you 3 times? Man, watch this. Okay.
Malchus.
How do we know his name was Malchus?
One of the Gospels says it was.
John says it. Why would John bother telling us who the name of the servant of the high priest is?
Traceability.
What's that?
Traceability.
Traceability. Okay. Okay. Details. Why else might he be meant? And I'm speculating here, but I'm not the only person who has speculated this way. Why else would John mention somebody by name?
Yeah, maybe he was somebody who converted later that they could actually go to talk to.
He's, at the very least, he's somebody he thinks his readers know. Okay? This guy Malchus. And of course, John is writing much later than the other Gospels. Good possibility he's talking about, our good brother Malchus. And fortunately, Luke, of all the three Gospel writers, tells us that, Jesus touched his ear and healed it. That might go a long way towards convincing, maybe this guy Jesus is something kind of special. Okay, it's just kind of an interesting detail. Luke, the physician, wants to talk about this. Make sure that this guy was healed. Jesus was not fighting back. He stopped his disciples, told them to put those two swords up, and touched Malchus's ear and healed him. And oh, by the way, it was Malchus. You guys know Malchus. You probably wondered why his ear looked so funny. Now you know. Okay. Again, I'm speculating a little bit there.
That ear did not look funny.
Great point. Thank you, Jeannie. If you were listening on, if you were listening on, and Jeannie didn't have the mic, it's Jesus healed him, so the ear did not look funny. Okay. Thank you for that correction. Okay. All right, I guess we need to stop there. We're out of time. We got over halfway through chapter 22. We'll pick up here next week with Peter and his denial of Jesus. Let's see, well, I've got these things up here. I wish you could see that up close. This is sort of the upper city of Jerusalem. That's the temple grounds. This thing in the front here with the big open courtyard, that's a recreation of what they thought let's see. Yeah, that's Herod's palace. That's not what I thought it was. I'll bring you another slide next week. But we'll stop there. Any last questions or comments? Yeah.
There's a great book written in the 1800s called Jesus the Messiah by Alfred Edersheim. Read it many years ago. Goes into a lot of the details. The historian. This is the first time I've heard anybody else talk about the positioning, and he said the exact same thing that this guy does.
Okay.
And the reasoning, the different positions they were. He said they would have been laying back on cushions or, on the floor with some kind of table setting.
Yeah, about 18 inches off the ground. Hard way to eat. I'm glad we don't do that anymore. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for this evening, chance we've had to come together and look at your word. And we've speculated a little bit, but just in awe of it, we just see the wisdom of your plan, the servanthood of Jesus, the way that neither betrayal or temple guards or anything could distract and keep from having your will done. Resulted in the sacrifice of your Son for our sins. We thank you for the new covenant. We thank you that we certainly have not done anything to deserve it. You have declared it, and you have declared by yourself that you will be faithful and that you will take care of us, and that through our high priest Jesus we have access to you. We come to you now in his name, asking you to go with us, give us good rest tonight, bless our affairs tomorrow and the folks that we're around. Be with Lenora as she recuperates from her surgery tonight, and others that need your healing. And we're just grateful for all your blessings, and pray in your Son's name. Amen.